The base had no name anymore. They'd stopped giving names to places that might not exist in a month. Yara pressed her palm against the observation port and watched the asteroid's shadow crawl across the inner hull. The same slow eclipse it made every 4 hours. The same cold geometry that had been their ceiling and their calendar for 11 months. Beneath her hand, the metal was cold enough to sting. She kept it there anyway. Some things you held onto, not because they felt good, but because they reminded you what feeling was. Behind her, Declan was eating something from a foil pouch that smelled faintly of synthetic chicken and regret. He ate the same way he did everything since the Varric landed. With the mechanical patience of a man rationing himself, making each bite deliberate, each breath a small act of not giving up. "You look like you're waiting for someone," he said without looking up. "I'm thinking." "You do that a lot for someone who claims to have run out of ideas." She turned. The briefing room, if you could call it that, was a repurposed storage bay about the size of a shipping container. 3 mismatched chairs, a folding table, 2 screens, one of which had a crack running through the upper left quadrant that bent every map they pulled up into something that looked like a wound. On the second screen, the Varric Adjudicator's last public transmission played on loop. They'd been watching it so long they'd stopped really seeing it. The way you stop seeing a painting you live with. The vast pale architecture of the aliens standing in the ruins of the Sydney Opera House, with its 4-jointed arms folded behind it, speaking in that frequency that registered in the human brainstem as the memory of a door slamming. The third member of their crew, Pell, was asleep in the corner, on a folded thermal blanket with one arm crooked under her head. She was 19. She was the best network infiltrator any of them had ever seen, which was the reason she was here, and not on the surface with whoever was left on the surface. "Pull up the archive map again," Yara said. Declan set down his pouch. He didn't sigh. He had given up sighings around month 4, the same way you eventually stop flinching at a sound that never stops. The cracked screen shifted. What came up looked, at first glance, like a star chart, an enormous distributed network of nodes, each one a storage cluster, the whole thing spreading across 6 orbital platforms and 2 lunar installations. The Varric had called it, in their translated terminology, the repository. Every piece of human culture produced in the last 200 years. Archived, indexed, classified, and locked. Music, film, writing, broadcasts, games. Oral histories uploaded to digital formats before the people who told them were gone. The Varric had not destroyed any of it. That was the part people always got wrong. The Varric hadn't come to burn what humanity had made. They'd come to own it. They had landed with lawyers, not soldiers. Or the alien equivalent. Beings who carried not weapons but precedent. Vast legal architectures of interstellar intellectual property law, under which every act of human creation had been retroactively classified as a derivative work infringing on Varric cultural patents. The argument, such as it was, held that the Varric had developed narrative, music, and visual art 40,000 years before humanity, and therefore all subsequent human creative production constituted unauthorized reproduction. The Varric's adjudicator had stood in front of the United Nations, 7 feet of pale architecture, in a body that moved like a mantis made of ivory, and issued what the translators rendered as the copyright commandments. 11 directives. The 11th was the one that ended arguments. All future human creative production was suspended pending review. The review would take, by Varric reckoning, approximately 300 years. What followed was not a war, exactly. There were no battles. There were enforcement actions. There were compliance sweeps. There were nights when the drones came through a city and anything that was making sound that hadn't been licensed stopped making sound. And sometimes the people attached to the sound stopped too. The human governments had capitulated inside of a year. Not because they were cowardly, or not only that, but because the Varric enforcement infrastructure was everywhere, and made of something humans didn't have a good word for. Not violence, not law, but some third thing that lived in the space between them, a certainty so complete it had the weight of physics. 11 months later, 3 people in a stolen asteroid base were looking at a map. "The signal archive is here," Yara said, tapping a node near the center of the display. "That's where they keep the oldest recordings. Pre-digital, the stuff they had to convert. The one they call the deep repository," Declan said. "The one they call the deep repository. The one that's inside an orbital platform with 12 enforcement nodes and a direct uplink to the adjudicator. That's the one." Pell made a sound from the corner. Not a word. A particular quality of silence that indicated she had been awake the whole time, and was now choosing to stop pretending. Tell me the part again, she said. Where we go in there and come out alive. I haven't gotten to that part yet. You've been thinking about this for 3 weeks. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks and I haven't gotten to that part yet. That's different. Pell sat up. Her hair was flat on one side and wild on the other, and she had a crease on her cheek from the blanket's seam. She looked at the map the way she always looked at networks, not with awe but with a kind of professional appetite, measuring distance, calculating angles, finding the place where a system's confidence in itself became a blind spot. The deep repository, she said. Not the entertainment archive, not the broadcast banks, the deep one. Where they put the oldest signal they found, Yara said. The first human broadcast they classified. The one that went out in 1955 and hit their monitoring array and started this whole thing. Because they heard it and they recognized it, Declan said. As derivative, that's what they said. A man singing about his hips. A man singing. About joy. About the specific, irreverent, absolutely human act of moving your body in a way that embarrassed respectable people. Which, apparently, the Varrock had patented 40,000 years ago. They patented joy, Pell said flatly. They patented the organizational principle. The conversion of internal emotional states into rhythmic external expression for the purpose of social cohesion and cultural transmission. Yara paused. Their lawyers were very good. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when people are looking at the same thing from inside different versions of despair. Declan reached into his jacket pocket and produced a flask. It was battered aluminum, the engraving on it worn down to a suggestion of something that might once have been letters. He took a pull, set it on the table between them like a mediator. Neither of them touched it. The plan, Yara said finally, is not to destroy anything. We go in, we find the original signal, we reconstruct it, and we broadcast it on every frequency the Varrock Enforced Network uses. Every channel, all at once. To what end, Pell said. Not a question exactly. More like someone asking you to say the hard part out loud. The adjudicator processes everything on those channels. Every enforcement protocol runs through it. If we push the original signal through, the full pattern, not a fragment, it has to adjudicate it. It has to engage with it. And a being that has spent 40,000 years deciding what is and isn't derivative. Yara stopped. Started again. Something that old and that certain. I don't think it's ever had to actually feel anything it didn't expect. You think it'll confuse it. I think it'll have to stop. Even if just for a moment. Even if just long enough. Long enough for what? Yara looked at the map. At the deep repository node, pulsing gently at the center of everything. Long enough for people to remember that they're allowed to make noise. Declan picked up the flask, held it out. This time both of them took it. The insertion point was a maintenance conduit on the platform's secondary ring. Accessible through a frequency gap that Pell had found 3 days earlier, and had been watching with the focused suspicion of someone who doesn't trust gifts. The gap was real. The gap stayed open. Either the Varrock didn't know about it or they knew and didn't care, which meant either they were sloppy or they were confident, and the Varrock were not sloppy. They don't think anyone would come here, Declan said, half to himself, as they threaded through the conduit in single file, suit, lights off, navigating by the faint operational glow of the platform's infrastructure. That's the thing about having the law on your side. After a while you stop imagining anyone would disagree. He said it quietly. The way you say something you've been sitting with for a long time. They came out of the conduit into the outer ring of the archive proper, and for a moment none of them moved. The repository was not what Yara had pictured from the outside. She'd imagined something cold and bureaucratic. Server banks, storage columns, the functional architecture of a filing system. What she walked into was closer to a cathedral, and she knew immediately that this was deliberate on the Varrock's part. Because they were not an unsubtle species. The space was vast, the ceiling lost in a kind of luminous haze that pulsed in slow intervals, and along the walls at intervals of about 10 meters were what looked like windows. Except the windows looked inward, not outward, and through each one something played. Not on screens, in the air itself, projected into pockets of contained atmosphere, small dioramas of compressed human experience. Pell stopped in front of one without meaning to. Through the window, about a meter deep, a room was playing. Kitchen. American, mid-century, yellow walls, a radio on the counter. A woman was cooking something, and she was not paying attention to what her hands were doing, because she was listening. The music coming from the radio was barely audible through whatever mediums separated the display from the corridor. Yara caught only the rhythm of it, the low-end pulse, The specific gravity of a sound that wanted to move you. The woman swayed once, slightly, the way people do when they forget they're in a body that other people can see. Then she caught herself and went back to cooking, and the image looped from the beginning. They keep them playing, Declan said quietly. They're not preserving them, Yara said. They're farming them. She'd understood this intellectually before. Standing in it was different. The Varric didn't need electricity exactly. They needed what human researchers had eventually termed resonance. The emotional charge generated by the interaction between a human nervous system and a cultural artifact. Memory made kinetic. The repository was not a library. It was a battery, and the power source was everything humans had ever felt when a song made them stop what they were doing. Don't look at them too long, Yara said, moving ahead. She kept her eyes forward and still managed to catch, at the edge of her peripheral vision, pieces of other windows. A crowd at a baseball game, the specific noise of tens of thousands of people who all wanted the same thing at the same time. A child laughing at a cartoon. A man in a dark theater, alone, crying at something that wasn't real and feeling no shame about it. She moved faster. The deep repository was at the center of the platform, behind 3 levels of archived material, and getting through each level required Pell to do things to security nodes that Yara couldn't follow and didn't try to. She watched the corridor instead, the long luminous nave of it, while Pell worked and Declan stood at the rear and didn't say anything, which was how you knew he was afraid. He was afraid the same way he was always afraid, with his jaw set and his breathing careful, the flask not touching his lips, because this was not the time for that, keeping himself sharp with the precise discipline of a man who had decided that being scared was acceptable and being careless was not. The inner chamber was smaller than Yara expected. The deep repository was a single room, roughly circular, with a column at the center about 2 meters high that pulsed with a light source so old and compressed it had a color she couldn't name, something between amber and the specific warmth of a lamp left on in a window at night. Around the column, orbiting it slowly in the pressurized atmosphere, were what she recognized as converted analog signals. Electromagnetic patterns translated into Varric storage format, ghostly and almost formless. Each one a specific frequency range, a specific moment in time. The oldest was at the base of the column. It was not labeled. The Varric didn't label things the way humans did. But she knew it the way you know a face you've only seen in photographs. From the shape of it, the specific gravity of a signal that had traveled far enough and long enough to accumulate something like weight. There, she said. Pell was already moving. She pulled the transceiver from her pack. 3 months of building it from stolen components. A device that could read Varric storage format and convert it back to analog broadcast on the fly, and began the extraction. That was when the enforcement nodes activated. Not all at once. That would have been loud. And the Varric didn't believe in unnecessary loudness. They believed in sufficiency. 3 drones materialized at the chamber entrance, hovering at shoulder height. Each one a smooth oblate shape that caught the amber light and threw it back in a way that made them look like they were already claiming the room. Declan stepped into the doorway between them and the drones. Go, he said, not loudly. Dec. I know what I'm doing. He said it the way people say things they're not entirely sure of but have decided to commit to anyway, which is the most human kind of certainty there is. Pell, how long? 90 seconds. I have 90 seconds. He reached into his jacket. Not for a weapon. They hadn't brought weapons. You couldn't fight enforcement drones with weapons. But for a small device that Yara recognized as a frequency emitter tuned to 19 different archived signal bands simultaneously. He'd built it in the 3rd month. He'd called it chaff, which was an old word for old tricks, and she'd thought at the time it was too simple. He activated it. The drones stopped. They stopped the way you stop when someone says something in a crowded room that doesn't make sense, and you need a moment to process it before you respond. The chaff was throwing fragments of archived signals at them. Not enough to constitute a broadcast, not enough to trigger any single enforcement protocol, but enough to force each drone's processing to adjudicate multiple micro-violations simultaneously. A bar of a song here, 3 frames of a film there, the specific cadence of a laugh track, human cultural chaff filling their sensory field like static. It bought 93 seconds, which was 3 more than Pell needed. Got it, she said. Then the adjudicator arrived. Yara had seen it on screens. On screens it was large. In the room it was something else. Not larger, exactly, but more present. The way a word spoken aloud is different from the same word read. It came through the chamber wall, the way its kind always moved. through the infrastructure of the platform itself, its physical body assembled at their location from the environmental matter that the Varric had long ago learned to move through like a medium. It stood at the far end of the chamber and looked at them. It had no eyes. Technically, it had structures that served the same function. They were turned on Yara with an attention so complete it felt like a physical force. The gaze of something that had been deciding things for so long that its attention alone had the quality of judgment. "You have accessed protected material," it said. The translation came through the earpiece as a clean, flat voice. Because the Varric translation protocols had no setting for inflection, they rendered everything in neutral because they believed that emotional tone was a distortion of pure information. "The material you have recovered is the property of the Varric Cultural Collective under Commandment 7 of the..." "Play it," Yara said to Pell. "Yara, play it now." The transceiver uplinked to every enforcement frequency simultaneously. All 12 nodes, the full network, every channel the adjudicator used to process the platform's operations and issue its directives to the drones below. Pell had built the uplink for this specific purpose, and it was working. The signal threading through the network at broadcast speed, the oldest human recording pushing itself into every available conduit. The adjudicator stopped speaking. Not because it had been interrupted, because something was happening in its processing that required all available attention. The signal was not a weapon. Yara had always known it was not a weapon, and she had let the others believe it might be one because she knew what it actually was, and she needed them with her anyway. The signal was a 1955 recording of a young man from Mississippi who had gone into a small studio and done something that no one had told him to do, that no one had given him permission to do, that several people had actively suggested he should not do, which was to take the music he'd grown up hearing and bend it through his own body until it came out as something that had never existed before. Not derivative of what came before it, not a reproduction of an existing form. Something new, made of old materials, the way every human thing had always been made. The adjudicator had classified it as derivative. The adjudicator had been wrong. What happened when the signal played through the network was not dramatic, at least not on the outside. The adjudicator's body went still. Stiller than its normal stillness, which was already a kind of geological patience, and it stood in the amber light of the deep repository, with its four-jointed arms at its sides and its sensory structures turned inward, and it adjudicated. It adjudicated for a long time. Long enough for the three of them to breathe. Long enough for Declan to pick up his flask and take one slow, considered pull and put it away again. Long enough for a bar of the signal to find its way through a secondary uplink. Pell had buried in the network 3 layers deep, and from there into the broader enforcement grid, and from there into the 7 other repository installations, and from there into the compliance monitoring systems that sat above every city that still had people in it, broadcasting a low enforcement tone that kept them from making the kinds of sounds that weren't licensed. The compliance tone in those cities flickered. Yara didn't know about that yet. She would know later when the reports came in, and she would feel many things about it, but right now she was watching the adjudicator and waiting. "This recording," the adjudicator said finally, and its voice through the translation earpiece had something in it that the protocol had setting for. A quality that wasn't quite uncertainty but was adjacent to it, the sound of a processing system encountering a classification problem it had never been designed to handle. "This recording is not a derivative work." "No," Yara said. "It's not. The collective has held otherwise for. The collective was wrong. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. It had texture to it." "Wait. If this recording is not derivative," the adjudicator said, with the careful precision of something working through a logical cascade that had no clean terminus, "then the foundational precedent of Commandment 7 is." "Wrong," Yara said again. "They're all wrong, every single one. Everything we made was ours, all of it. Every song, every story. Every 3 frames of something that made someone cry in a dark theater when they thought no one could see them." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "You can own a star. You can measure it and name it and file the paperwork. The light that comes off it is still just light. You can't own what it does to someone when they see it." The adjudicator was quiet for long enough that Declan shifted his weight, and Pell made a small sound that was either hope or its close relative. Then it said, "The adjudication is ongoing," which was not a victory, but it was not a verdict either. They left the chamber the way they'd come in, through the conduit, through the dark, back into the asteroid that had no name. None of them spoke during the transit. Speaking felt like it might disturb something. The specific fragile quality of a thing that hasn't yet been decided, that exists in the interval between a question asked and an answer given. They came out into the base's main corridor, and the first thing Yara noticed was the sound. It was coming from the communications board, a faint, crackling transmission that Declan was at in 2 strides, pulling up the source, his hands moving with the urgent precision of someone who already knows the signal is real and is catching up to themselves. It was coming from a city. From inside a city that had been compliance monitored for 9 months, that had been running under enforcement suppression for so long that the people in it had stopped making sounds they weren't sure were licensed. Someone's in that city had done something that registered on the board as a broadcast signal. It was music, not much, a few bars. Someone at a window, or on a rooftop, or in a room, with a radio they'd kept hidden, broadcasting something on a frequency that was not licensed, that the compliance systems above the city should have caught and suppressed, except the compliance systems above the city were running a secondary adjudication protocol because the signal from the deep repository had threaded through them 40 minutes ago, and they were still working out what they thought about it. The music was thin and staticky, and it lasted about 90 seconds before it cut out. Then from a second city, something started, then a third. Declan's face did a complicated thing that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a cry, and occupied the territory between them with the awkward dignity of a person who has been correct about something they desperately wanted to be wrong about. 3 weeks, he said. You knew for 3 weeks. I didn't know, Yara said. I hoped. What's the difference? She thought about the woman in the archive, swaying once to a sound through a kitchen radio. The way the sway happened before the self-consciousness did. The lag between the body's knowledge and the mind's permission. One of them you can prove, she said. The other one you just have to do. The communications board was still accumulating signals. Slowly, unevenly. A city going quiet after 20 seconds, and then something from a different latitude entirely. It was not a revolution. It did not look like a revolution. It looked like what it was. People in the dark deciding one at a time that they were going to make a sound. Not because they were certain it was safe. Not because the law had changed. Not because anyone had given them permission. But because the part of them that needed to was older than the part of them that was afraid. Pell was watching the board with her knees pulled up to her chest and her chin on her hands, and the expression she had was one that Yara had not seen on her in 11 months. Not strategy, not calculation, not the focused professional appetite of someone measuring angles. Just a young woman watching something she hadn't expected to see and being ambushed by it. Do you think it'll hold? Pell asked. The adjudication. Do you think it actually? I don't know, Yara said, but the signal is still in the network. Yes, so it's still playing. Every F1 channel they have, until they clear it. Yara paused. Which they'll have to adjudicate. Which will take time, Declan said. Time. Pell made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something that didn't have a name yet. Yara went back to the observation port. The asteroid Shadow was starting its slow crawl across the inner hull again. The same eclipse, the same cold geometry, the same 4-hour interval that had been their ceiling and their calendar. She pressed her palm against the port, and this time the metal was still cold enough to sting. She kept her hand there anyway. Below, very far below, small and crackling and utterly unauthorized, something was playing that had no legal standing whatsoever, that was not cleared or licensed or compliant with 11 commandments, handed down by a species that had been deciding things for 40,000 years. And which was, in spite of everything, in spite of the math of it and the law of it and the certainty of it, still exactly what it had always been. A signal, going out, looking for someone to hear it. The board added a 4th city, then a 5th. Then 2 more almost simultaneously, which meant somewhere 2 people had made the same decision at nearly the same moment, without knowing the other one was making it, which was, Yara thought, one of the more human things she had ever seen. She stayed at the port until Declan put his hand on her shoulder and said they should probably eat something. And she said yes, and they went to eat, and the board kept accumulating, and the signal kept playing, and somewhere in the network a very old, very certain intelligence that had never once been wrong about anything, sat with a classification problem it had no precedent for, and adjudicated in silence, which was the most they could ask for, and which was for now, enough.